This is Stefan Schmidt for InsiderIowa.com. One of the big stories of the moment is the debate about gun control in the United States. We know that there have been a lot of shootings. We know that there is a lot of concern about people with mental disabilities or people with criminal records having access to guns and then abusing them. The school shooting in Connecticut, in which so many young children were killed by a gunman, has become especially a kind of moment when Americans are talking about gun control, and they're talking about it on both sides. You know, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and the Vice President and members of Congress, and a lot of the parents, in fact, most of the parents of the children that were killed, have said we need some gun control. We need some new way of reducing the possibility of these kinds of massacres happening while still respecting the Second Amendment that Americans have a constitutional right to own firearms. And so on the one hand, there has been a lot of this public discussion that has been promoted by the president and especially by many Democrats and groups that are in favor of some sort of regulation, new regulations. But on the other side, the National Rifle Association and other gun owner groups have also pushed back very heavily, including advertising, including mass emailings to NRA members and others, press conferences, and even advertising on television. So gun control, it's a rare moment that gun control is once again a public discussion in the United States. Now, the thing that I find very interesting and also somewhat surprising is that the U.S. Senate is debating gun control, and there are several proposals. One of them is to limit these magazine size, the size of clips, how many bullets a clip can hold, so that it isn't unlimited. We now have ammunition clips that hold 100 or more shells, bullets, and so if someone begins to shoot, they can shoot 100 times before they have to reload. And that really is, in a way, a sort of combat kind of operation. That's what you want the military to be able to do, because they may be in a firefight with a lot of enemy forces. Americans like to collect guns, and a lot of Americans like guns with large magazines because they like shooting them. On the other hand, lately, we've had a number of incidents, including the school in Connecticut, in which gunmen have, in fact, also gotten a hold of those guns. And in some instances, like a student at the University of South Florida or Central Florida, they didn't actually carry anything out, but the student was discovered that he was going to do something, and then he shot himself before he actually committed an act. And they found huge amounts of ammunition and weapons with large magazines in his dorm room. And so there has been a discussion as to whether that should be limited. The Senate has been discussing that. There has been also a discussion as to whether the background checks should now be increased from gun shops and professional gun sales to also personal sales and sales at gun shows, usually held at fairgrounds and other places around the country, gun swaps, where people bring their guns and sell them to other civilians, not so much in a formal business, but you know, in a kind of informal transaction like you would in a garage sale. And there's been some indication that that would perhaps control the number of guns that fall into the hands of people who might have criminal records or otherwise not be able to pass a sheriff's background check, a law enforcement background check to issue a gun license or to issue a license, a permit to buy a gun or to carry a gun. And the National Rifle Association is absolutely opposed to any of that. And the Senate would like to discuss whether or not there's enough support in the Senate for some kind of new gun regulations. not to take away people's guns, not to prohibit guns, but to essentially try to keep them out of the hands as much as possible of people who shouldn't have them. The actual background checks for guns, I just saw a number this morning, have produced something like 2 million individuals who were denied a permit to go buy a gun at a gun shop, because when they did the background check, they found that these people had all kinds of criminal records. In some cases, because the person applied for a gun permit, law enforcement was actually able to show up at the gun shop and arrest the person that they had been looking for a long time. They were domestic abusers, had been threatening and beating up their wives or friends. And so there is some evidence that background checks, in fact, do prevent a significant number of people from getting firearms. But the Senate has decided that maybe they don't even want to vote on anything. And a number of Republicans, mostly Republicans, have said, we are going to filibuster. In other words, we are going to use the Senate rule where we can talk and talk and talk and talk endlessly to even prevent the Senate from actually voting on yes or no on some forms of gun regulation that are in some bills that are floating around the Senate. And that is a surprising thing to me, because in fact, the Senate is supposed to be a place where they debate things, where they look at the pros and cons of various solutions, and then at some point when they're ready, they vote, and they vote yes or they vote no. But to basically say, well, we're not even going to allow a vote because we don't want to take a chance that something might pass the Senate, is definitely not in the spirit of the Founding Fathers who created the Senate and who wanted the Senate to think long and hard before they made decisions, but not to be a place where ideas die. It was supposed to be a place where ideas are publicly discussed, debated, and then voted on, so that we can measure, you know, what the sense of the Senate is. The biggest, I think, disappointment is that 90% of Americans, in some polls a little less or a little more, depending, actually supports increased background checks before someone can buy a gun. Now, 90% of Americans don't even agree on what side of the horizon the sun rises at, you know? I mean, Americans just don't agree on a lot of stuff. And if 90% of Americans in poll after poll think that more background checks to keep people who shouldn't have guns from owning them is a substantial number. And the Senate, to me, it's surprising, is apparently somewhat deaf to the fact that Americans would like to see at least some small gestures made to try and control this problem. We will see whether, in fact, anything comes out of there and whether there is any even minor new regulation. I would add, and I've written about this, you've probably read some articles by me, that the Constitution, when it says something, is not absolute. Freedom of speech, which is in the First Amendment of the Constitution, is not absolute. We regulate certain freedom of speech, we regulate obscenity, we regulate slander, we regulate things that have a negative impact on society, even though we generally support freedom of speech. And the Second Amendment, I think, was never intended to be an absolute and ironclad right of Americans to own any kind of guns all the time, regardless. I think the Second Amendment, like every other part of the Constitution, is a general principle, and you can kind of adjust it and say, right to own guns, but there are a couple of exceptions. There are some exceptions, and we would not allow Americans to buy shoulder-fired missiles that can knock down airplanes, and those are a form of guns. And we probably don't want Americans owning rocket-propelled grenades, which are another form of gun. And it's not clear to me that we really want Americans to own 50 caliber machine guns that are fed by a belt that we use on top of armored vehicles in Afghanistan and Iraq and to fight wars. And so we already have certain types of guns that we really regulate. And the question is, do we want to and should we add to those regulations a few other things that might reduce the number of individuals who should not have weapons from having them, without in any way infringing on the right of Americans who are law-abiding, pay their taxes, and will use their guns responsibly from having them. And I think we don't know the end result of it, but it's an interesting discussion, and certainly the politicians in Washington have a big challenge in trying to respond, on the one hand, to the 90% of Americans who would like something done, and the opposition from many gun lobbies who think that any regulation is the beginning of a slippery slope to eventually taking away all guns from Americans, which is, I think, a ridiculous idea. I mean, nobody wants to take away all the guns from all Americans. So let's watch that one and see how it comes out. This is Stephan Schmidt for InsiderIowa.com.